Hey guys, welcome to your second video of the year. So this one's all about biology, and we're kind of just going to get into the very top layer of biology, and so you're going to kind of see an introduction to all of the things we'll be talking about throughout the entire school year. This is really just to help you get an understanding and get your mindset right for what the actual study of life is. And so I'm going to explain that in a little more detail. This is the second section of the chapter. Again, don't focus on the chapter numbers so much because the next section or the next video of that I'm going to give you guys doesn't actually go with any chapter. I'm just adding it to this the particular first information that you're going to get from me. So again, we have an objective slide, and so these are the 4 things that I would expect you to be able to know and talk about after this video. So you're going to list the characteristics of all living things. You should be able to state 4 unifying principles of biology. You should be able to describe how living things interact, and you should be able to explain how life on Earth evolved. So like I've said before, biology is the science of life or the study of life. And so everything that we talk about this year will involve life. So that means that something is considered living. There are 6 characteristics that I want you to know about that would consider something living. So last year you focused solely on natural phenomenon within the world. And so everything you talked about was non-living. Now we are turning our focus into all of the living components. And if you go on into chemistry, you'll pursue non-living again. But those non-living factors contribute to a living factor. And so the 6 characteristics that I want you to know about and I want you to write down are these 6 here. All of these guys here. And they are the characteristics of life, are to respond to the environment. So you should for example, if I was walking outside and I heard a weird noise, I would be able to turn towards that noise. Grows and develops. So an embryo in a mother's stomach will eventually grow into a fetus, which will eventually grow into a baby and continue to grow and develop. Produce offspring. So back to my example of a mother carrying a child. Maintain homeostasis, and this one may be a new word to you. Homeostasis. So if you want to underline that, if you don't know what that means, we're going to go into a little more detail. Basically, that means that you stay at a constant. You don't, like, for example, your temperature, it doesn't spike, especially when you're not sick. You can breathe without really thinking about it. You blink. You maintain a constant state of aliveness, if that's a word. Complex chemistry, and so you're made up of more than one type of molecule. In fact, these molecules are so complex. They make up things like our DNA, our proteins that we need to survive and help build a muscle, and we'll get into those details. And then finally, the final characteristics of life is that you consist of cells. Now, whether that be one cell or multicellular, that will depend on the complexity of the organism. But even if you just have one cell, you are still considered living. We are going to go into all of these characteristics in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So you may want to leave a little bit of space in between or be able to write off on the side here. So response to environments, maybe right off to the side. You don't need very much room, but it depends on how big you write, I guess, really. All right, so this is what I was talking about, that you're going to add a little bit. So to respond to your environment. And so I gave you the example, if I'm walking outside and it's dark outside and I hear a really weird noise, I'm going to turn and respond towards that noise, and I may even run. Living things detect changes around them and are able to respond to that. So again, I heard a weird noise, I responded by running away. Growth and development. Living things undergo changes that will help with survival. So another really a good visual would be like a tadpole. A tadpole undergoes so many changes and metamorphosis in order to develop into an adult, which can fully function and provide for itself and for its offspring. Reproduction. Living things are able to pass on heritable traits to their offspring, ensuring the survival of a species. So the biggest component of ensuring a species survival is reproduction, being able to pass on traits that are beneficial to an offspring. So for example, in England, I don't know the year, but anyways, in England, they had this pepper-spotted moth. And so the whole thing is that England was starting to get really smoggy. And these moths that were black in color would go and hang out on trees. And then you had moths that were white in color that would hang out on the same trees. Now, if you have smog in the air and you have black moths and white moths, which do you think a bird is more likely to see? And if you guessed a white moth, then you are correct. So white moths ended up getting eaten quite rapidly, whereas the black moths were not, and they were able to pass on those traits to their offspring, ensuring the survival of their species. And so reproduction is really, really just for passing on beneficial traits. All right, continuing on with our characteristics of life. Keeping things constant. So I talked about homeostasis is a living thing's ability to maintain a constant internal environment. So a big one I can think of right off the top of my head is body temperature. If you take your temperature in the morning, you're probably about 98.6. You take your temperature at night, you're probably about 98.4. Either way, you're not really getting hotter or colder throughout the day. You're able to maintain that internal temperature. And so your body is internally surviving, and there are functions that are going on in your body that you don't even control that are just going on by themselves. Complex chemistry, so all living things are composed of many complex molecules that aid in survival. So like I talked about a little while ago, DNA, proteins, carbohydrates, all of these things are essential for our survival and essential for making up a living organism. And finally, cells. Cells are found in every living thing. This is the basic unit that makes up every single thing. And there are different types of cells that we will go into great detail in. So don't worry if you maybe know a little more than I'm giving right now. We will go into details on these. Cells help us. So one thing, so like a drop of blood has like millions of cells in it, and every single cell contributes to a job and a function of wherever it's at in an organism's body. So for example, you have muscle cells that are meant to contract and help with lifting and different things like that, in comparison to your cells, your nerve cells, which are meant to send signals throughout your body. So every cell, even though they are essentially identical, they have a different function, and so they perform in a different way. So we were just talking about the six the six characteristics that classify an organism as living or not. Now we're going to turn our focus into unifying principles of biology. So these are principles that form the backbone of biology. These are all the things that a biologist somehow in some way studies. No matter what kind of biologist you are still looking at something that contributes to biology in some way with these four principles. So the four principles are the cell theory, the gene theory, homeostasis, and evolution. And we are going to go into detail on those. I gave you a little bit of details here. I can't remember if the next slide has more details, so stay tuned. All right, so the cell theory is that all living things are made up of cells, and we talked about that. So like I said, all biologists, if they're studying anything that is living, which that's what they're doing as a job because they are a biologist, everything is made up of cells. So again, if you're a single-celled organism all the way to multicellular organisms as complex as humans, you are still studying, you're still focusing on the fact that everything is made up of cells. The gene theory is that all characteristics a living thing has are controlled and given off by genes. So you look the way you look, you essentially act the way you act because of the genes that were passed on to you from your parents. Now, obviously, there's more that goes into that, and when we get into genetics, you'll see that there's more to play with it, especially within complex organisms like humans. But basically, everything that we have about us is because of the fact that we were passed on these traits from our mom and our dad. Homeostasis, and so we've got into this twice already, is consistency. It's the fact that everything is going to maintain itself and remain stable. And finally, evolution, a change in living things over a series of time. The idea is to evolve and to change and to accept that change. Natural selection goes very well into evolution. It's the idea that favorable genes are passed on to the next generation. So a couple slides ago, I talked about the pepper spotted moss. The favorable gene was that they were black. And so those were passed on to the future generation so that they weren't eaten by birds. So the idea around evolution is that a change will take place over a series of time due to natural selection, due to a favorable gene that has been passed on. And I just looked at I looked at the next slide, and it turns out that there is no more to the unifying principles of biology. We will go over this a little more in class, so don't worry if you don't feel like this is enough information for you. A little side note, if you are following along with the reading and you're doing the reading, you will not be doing the portion that talks about levels of organization and diversity of life. We will talk about that in class while we're talking about all these other slides. So I didn't really feel like I needed to make a slide on it. It would just take up too much time. All right, so let's talk about interactions between organisms. So there are different ways that organisms interact with one another. Interdependence of living things is the key here. So how do these organisms live within a community and how do they interact with one another? So organism, we've already kind of established this as an individual living thing. So I am an organism, human is more specific, but I am still an organism. I am a individual living thing. Living things are dependent on their surroundings for survival. And so that goes into play a lot for animals that live outside especially. But even as humans, we depend on our surroundings to provide nutrients for us. Like we can't make our own food, so we expect that our environment would do that for us, and we consume that. Another example of living and depending on your surroundings is a seed that's planted, and so once a seed is planted, the expectation is that it's going to use the nutrients around it to flourish and to grow into whatever it wants to grow, not whatever it wants to grow into, whatever it's supposed to grow into. So that's a really good example of depending on its environment. It's solely dependent on the environment, on the soil, on the water, on the nutrients, everything around it. Symbiosis, this is a relationship among organisms where at least one benefits. So, for example, and a good example would be alligators opening their mouths and birds flying in there, and they are eating out all of the leftover residue of food that's in the alligator's mouth. The alligator does not close its mouth. The benefit here is that the alligator gets clean teeth and the birds get to eat. So that's a good symbiotic relationship. Another one that's in your reading is like birds that are landing on deer, and they will essentially look for ticks and parasites and different things on the deer that they can eat. And so the deer is not really benefiting in any way, except for the fact that it's getting rid of parasites and different things that may be surrounding it or maybe hurting it in some way. Competition is a very big interaction within nature, and you see this all the time. I mean, if you're sitting there and you're racing somebody, that is a competition. There are bigger competitions that essentially go for survival, and you'll see this like on the nature channel. Relationships among organisms where all depend on the same resource. So hyenas and lions, or female lions that are going after a zebra. Okay, so they're both competing for the same food source. Who will win? It just really depends on the drive and the factors that are surrounding both the hyenas and the female lions. And finally, we are talking about evolution of life. And so the evolution of life is that basically it comes down to how was life developed in the world? How did we go from basically the world being developed or the world being formed to where we're at now? And there are obviously many theories around this, and I'm not here to tell you if you're right or wrong on what your beliefs are. I'm just here to pass on some information for you. So the most common theory is that simple single-celled organisms over time evolved into multicellular organisms, thus increasing the biodiversity of the earth. And so what that means is that at some point millions and millions of years ago, there was a single-celled organism. It eventually found its way and became an organism that had more than one cell, and it eventually kept growing and growing and growing. Traits kept passing on, things kept changing that were beneficial to this organism, and eventually multicellular organisms were created, and then we were able to evolve and change through natural selection into different species. And then biodiversity was greatly increased throughout millions and millions of years on the earth. The person that is attributed greatly to this theory of evolution is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a biologist who studied many things in his life, and he wrote a book known as On the Origin of Species. And so in his book, he stated the theory of evolution is by natural selection, and he also presented a lot of evidence that helped kind of solidify or kind of back this theory up. Now remember, from the first video I told you, theories are not proven, but they are greatly supported by evidence. So the biggest thing around Darwin was the fact that many people felt like this was a big bump into religious beliefs, and so they refused to believe that humans evolved from apes or chimps or anything like that. And really, Darwin was just saying that organisms change throughout life. So we have evolution of organisms is through natural selection, and this happens just, it has to happen in order for survival. So you're going to pass on natural traits that will help in the survival. The strong will survive. And his theory of evolution only explains how life changed on Earth, not how it began. So that's the biggest thing that I want you to get from this, is that Charles Darwin presented the theory of evolution on how life changed. He didn't present on how life began. So there still is no way to explain how life began. Charles Darwin just made some observations and said, there's a change that has gone on over a series of time that has allowed species to evolve. And that is the final slide of this video. If you have any questions, please ask on Edpuzzle. Don't forget that if you really want to know more information, in your reading on the very last page, there are questions that I highly suggest you answer. See you later.